that my mom and dad, Juana Gutierrez and Gabriel Gutierrez, members of Madres del Este de Los Angeles Santa Isabel, which was a community-based social justice organization, started doing work on quality of life issues. So they started addressing environmental justice issues, right? And it was around that time that, I don't know how it happened, but they came in contact with Martha and began to have a conversation about taking youth from LA up to Mount Lake to experience firsthand one of our primary water sources, right? That eventually evolved into what became the Mount Lake Committee's Outdoor Education Center. And so for about 30 years now, there have been different groups now from not only LA, but from throughout the state who have visited the center and undergone tremendous transformative experiences. And when I say transformative, I don't say it lightly. Whenever we do an evaluation of students, that one term constantly comes around and comes back, right? And it's a very genuine, really, expression that people use because for the first time in some cases, people are leaving the urban setting, right? Engaging in the beautiful, landscape and experiences that they experience at the OEC, right? And I have to say, this presentation, we're actually doing a co-presentation with Santiago Escuseria, who directs the Outdoor Education Center for the Mount Lake Committee. That experience really would not be possible without him, right? Because of I'll let him talk a little bit about some of the work that he does. What happened then is, I think in about 2015, there are a lot of different orgs that are taking their groups, including people who went through the Mothers of East LA process, right? Who started to take their own groups up into the Mount Lake area. So here I am teaching courses at Cal State Northridge, and I thought, well, why haven't I done it, right? So I started taking groups up. And what I try to do is I try to replicate pretty much, when I would go with my parents, my dad would narrate the different histories of the different locales and locations that we traverse, right? So here I am sharing that knowledge with my students. And of course, students being students, they have questions, right? And I don't have answers. I'm like, I wish I could turn to my dad and say, hey, so where'd you get this information from, right? So what happened is then that program began to evolve into moving beyond just being participants and observers to actually learning research skills, right? And applying them to a more holistic, very tangible outcomes that come from that experience. So what we developed, and based on the questions that they had, was that this history did not begin in the 1990s, right? Or it didn't begin in the 1980s, or for that matter, it didn't begin with the arrival of Europeans, to the Eastern Sierra, or for that matter, the western part and the southern part of those mountains, right? There have always been people here. And so when we started to look at how do we recover and reclaim those historical narratives, we developed an approach based on a palimpsest, right? And a palimpsest is this parchment, paper that is, it's like an ancient scroll that is written on, right? And then it's erased, and then it's reused, recycled, and written on again, and then it's erased, and then it's used again. And when, and those of us who come from a generation where we used to write on paper and then erase, right? What does it leave? It leaves an imprint. So in spite of the fact that you have this layer of knowledge on the top, you know that something else existed before. But you also know that it was very intentionally erased, right? So the questions that the students had really had us going back to asking questions about indigenous, the significance of indigenous civilizations and contributions to that corridor that comes from Mono Lake, down the Owens Valley, over into the San Fernando Valley, and then into the LA Basin, right? So what we did is we started to construct a method where students then began to access digital archives in order to reconstruct visual histories, right, of that corridor, right? So we began with the Kusarida, we begin with the Paiute down along the Owens Valley, we begin with the Tatapiam Fernandino in the San Fernando Valley, the Tombaquiche in the LA Basin, right? And what we did is we looked at where these villages originally existed. Right, so we did mapping, and we noticed that those villages exist along the different waterways, right? And that becomes really significant because all these other quote-unquote settlements that come with the Spanish, Mexican, and then later American experience, right, relied upon the existence of some indigenous village in order to then create, the city of LA, for example. The city of LA was founded in part because of the auxiliary mission to San Gabriel Mission, which is now known as La Placita Olvera, or in Olvera Street in LA, the founding of LA, right? That was placed there in part because of the attempt to evangelize and convert in other ways the indigenous village of Yangna. And so we find that these types of narratives become very, very present, right? Because we're not just recovering and reclaiming those historical narratives as in, okay, this happened and then it ended at this period when the Spanish-Mexican came and then, the Americans came, right? What we do is we thread that narrative, right, all the way through because folks are still here. They're very present. So this idea of the palimpsest, right, is then you begin to look at Spanish-Mexican land policy, dispossessions and redistributions, and then same thing for the American period and what have you. But all the while, right, those historical narratives continue, right? So that became a foundation then for students to then begin to ask, so tell us more about the organizations that have been coming, right, up to Mono Lake. So we start with, we've been doing work actually with the archives at Cal State Northridge on the Madres de Los Angeles that are very much related to the water conservation efforts, right? That include the very integrated, I guess, sort of project of the ultra low flush toilet redistribution, which I'll let Santiago talk a little bit more about. Right, but that really began to transform through the modification of practice and modification of behavior, right? How we eventually begin to draw this link between people in LA as consumers of water that comes from Mono Lake, right? And so the title for today, Mono Lake South, in part because as Santiago always tells us, he leads us through an exercise, right? And I think you might recall as an where he'll take you to this beautiful site somewhere, and it's always a different one, right? And we do a reflection exercise. And he says, everything that you see, you're going to take back with you, right? And I think in some cases, in a literal sense, people take Mono Lake back with them. And what it does is that it begins, you become very conscious, right? You think 3-minute showers, I don't know about that. Maybe 5 minutes, right? And then eventually maybe 4, and then 3, it's doable, right? But what it does is it plants in our minds, right? These ideas that change is not only possible, but it's inevitable because it's so necessary. And so we've also been doing work with some other organizations that include eShard Communities for Environmental Justice, Communities for a Better Environment, Pocono Beautiful, right? And these are all organizations that our students are doing service learning with, so that they're doing about 20 hours of service with these organizations. And part of the project, right, is not only to figure out, what their mission is, what their activities are, but what their connection is to Mono Lake. And so we're in the process right now of gathering that data and turning this thing, I think, into a much longer project, because we will continue to build on that. So I know my time is up, so I do want to introduce Santiago.